So we've been talking about the process of statistics, and we started talking about different types of sampling last time. Now we need to turn our attention to bias in sampling. So there are ways when you take a sample that it can go wrong, I guess is the best word to use, and that's if we have bias in our sampling. So we say that a sample has bias if the results of the sample are not representative of the population. So there are several ways that can happen. So sampling bias, and this is a particular type of bias, happens when the technique used to obtain the sample tends to favor one part of the population over another. So convenience samples are a good example of this. And that's because the individuals are not chosen randomly. Sampling bias also happens due to what we call undercoverage. And that occurs when the proportion of one segment of the population is lower in the sample than it is in the population. So let's say I interview people and I want an equal proportion, well, I want the same proportion of men and women as in the general population. And for some reason, even though I guess it's about 52% women and 48% men, I end up with only 30% men in my sample. That would be undercoverage. So undercoverage can happen if the frame is incomplete or not representative of the population. And all the frame is the list of the whole population. So sampling bias can lead to incorrect predictions. So for example, Literary Digest incorrectly predicted the outcome of the 1936 presidential election. They said that Alfred Landon, who was the Republican, would beat Franklin Roosevelt, who was the Democrat. The magazine's sample, though, was created from its subscribers, telephone directories, and automobile owners. The problem was this was in the middle of the Great Depression, and most of the people in those categories were Republicans, so the Democrats were undercovered, so their results were off. And they predicted the wrong person winning the election. So what they predicted was that Landon would win with 57% of the vote. What actually happened was that Roosevelt won with 62% of the vote. So that's a pretty big discrepancy, you can see. Okay, another type of bias is non-response. And non-response bias exists when individuals selected to be in the sample who do not respond have different opinions than people who do respond. So non-response can happen because certain individuals either don't want to respond or because the researcher is unable to contact them. So this actually happens in the census all the time. It's why they pay all those workers to go around and knock on people's doors if they don't respond to the mail request for information. And one of the categories of people they have trouble with is recent immigrants, because a lot of times they're scared to talk to representatives of the government. Also, homeless people tend not to respond. And clearly, those groups will have different opinions on a lot of things than the rest of us. Also, this is a place where the researcher or the data collector, in the case of the census, can't contact them because they'll call them or they'll knock on the door and they'll get no answer. So all surveys, doesn't matter what type of sampling option we use, can suffer from non-response. But there are ways to control this. You can use callbacks, meaning you call people back and remind them to do the survey or pester them until they give in. Or you can use rewards or incentives. So I used to work for a market research company, and we would do surveys for a radio station in the Philadelphia, Pennsylvania area. And there'd be a short little 3-minute survey, and based on that survey, if a person qualified, we would offer them the chance to do a much longer survey that took about an hour and a half, but we would pay them if they completed the survey. So that's an example of a reward or an incentive. So response bias, this is another type of bias, happens when the answers on a survey do not reflect the true feelings of the respondent. So this happens a lot. I have recently taken a political survey where they asked me, do I approve or disapprove of President Trump? And do I approve or disapprove of Democratic nominee Joe Biden? Well, my problem is the only options I had were approve, disapprove, or unsure. And I had a hard time answering because there are things I like about both candidates and there are things I dislike about both candidates. So the answers, you see, didn't reflect my true feelings. So response bias can happen in a couple ways. There can be interviewer error. And that's when a poorly trained interviewer cannot get the person on the other end that they're interviewing to give truthful responses. Or if the interviewer has a vested interest in the results. So that would be, if I were trying to make money off of a certain product, and by the way I ask my questions, I encourage people to answer favorably towards my product. Another way that response bias can happen is with misrepresented answers. And that's when the survey question or questions result in responses that either misrepresent facts or are flat out lies. So an example of this is when recent college graduates were surveyed and asked to say what their income is. One study found that they frequently lie and say that their income is more than it actually is. So we'll stop with this video here, and we will pick up with another type of response bias in the next video.